Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Analyzing Evil. Today, we're turning our attention to a world that many of us know intimately, not because it is unfamiliar, but because it feels uncomfortably real. This is Grand Theft Auto: San Andreas, a game often remembered for its scale, its freedom, and its chaos. But beneath the gunfire and the radio satire lies something far darker. A carefully constructed portrait of societal decay, of institutional failure, of a city that did not collapse but was slowly dismantled. Before we analyze individuals, before we discuss Carl Johnson, the gangs, or the corrupt officers, we must start with something far more important. We have to analyze the city itself. Because in San Andreas, evil does not originate from one man. It originates from Los Santos. Evil in Los Santos does not begin with violence. It begins with design. By the time Carl Johnson returns home, the city is already broken. The war has already been fought. The damage is already done. What CJ steps into is not a battlefield. It is a ruin. Los Santos was never built to be whole. Los Santos, like its real-world counterpart, grew outward instead of upward. Freeways carved through neighborhoods, not as acts of convenience, but as acts of separation. Entire communities, predominantly black and working class, were boxed in, isolated from economic centers, and quietly erased from the city's plans. In the San Andreas universe, neighborhoods like Grove Street were never meant to thrive. They were meant to contain. Factories closed, legitimate work disappeared, education systems collapsed under neglect, and as opportunity withdrew, something else filled the vacuum. Not chaos, but economics. Jobs that once sustained families, manufacturing, port labor, and union-backed industries disappeared through deindustrialization. What replaced them were low-wage service roles that were never reached. Neighborhoods like Grove Street. Schools deteriorated, housing values collapsed, political influence evaporated. The city didn't explode, it was hollowed out, and when opportunity leaves, something else always moves in. In the early years before San Andreas begins, Los Santos transforms, not one of progress, but of abandonment. The state retreats, investment dries up, public services become hostile rather than supportive. Police presence increases, but not protection. Communities are no longer treated as citizens. They are treated as territory. This is where the first cracks form. Young men, cut off from legitimate paths forward, begin organizing not out of malice, but necessity. Gangs in San Andreas are not born as criminal empires. They begin as social structures, surrogate families, and mechanisms of survival. But survival has a cost. Crack cocaine enters San Andreas the same way it enters the real-world Los Angeles. Quietly, efficiently, and with devastating precision. In the mid to late 1980s, crack spread rapidly through south-central Los Angeles. It was cheaper than powdered cocaine, easier to distribute, and brutally addictive. Entire neighborhoods were flooded almost overnight. Violence followed not because crack created evil, but because it monetized desperation. San Andreas didn't explain this epidemic through cutscenes or expositions. It simply showed the aftermath. By the time the player arrives, families are fractured, gangs have replaced community institutions, survival has become a full-time occupation. The game implies what history confirms. Crack did not spread organically, it was allowed to spread, and once it took hold, the state responded, not with aid, but with force. The real-life parallel is unmistakable. In 1992 Los Angeles, erupted after a small group of officers who brutally beat Rodney King. The riots were not spontaneous. They were the release of decades of pressure. San Andreas captures this tension through its atmosphere: aggressive policing, racial profiling, neighborhood treated as enemy territory. The Ballers are often framed as Grove Street villains, but they are more accurately its future accelerated. They embraced crack early, built distribution networks, laundered money through front business, and aligned themselves with corrupt police protection. They didn't destroy the community, they exploited a wound that already existed. The tragedy is that Grove Street and the Ballers are not opposites. They are divergent responses to the same abandonment. In this world, gangs did not emerge as villains, they emerge as replacements. They provided structure where none existed, income where jobs were gone, identity where society offered none, and once entrenched, they became another trap feeding the same cycle that created them. The crack epidemic in San Andreas is never explicitly shown arriving because it doesn't need to be. By the time we see Los Santos, the poison is already in the bloodstream. Drugs spread not because communities demanded them, but because they were profitable, easy to distribute, and devastatingly effective at exploiting desperation. Crack cocaine floods neighborhoods like Grove Street with surgical precision. Addiction rises, violence follows, not because the drug creates evil, but because it monetizes suffering. In San Andreas' universe, this position is not an accident. It is tolerated, and later it is weaponized. As drugs take hold, law enforcement does not intervene to heal the damage. Instead, law enforcement officers rise through the ranks. The crash unit is not an anomaly. It is the logical evolution of a system that no longer sees these neighborhoods as worth saving. Drugs justify militarized policing. Militarized policing justifies brutality. Brutality deepens resentment, and resentment fuels violence. The cycle becomes self-sustaining, and crucially, no one at the top has any incentive to stop it. Los Santos is not failing. It is functioning exactly as designed. By the time the player becomes the protagonist of the game, Carl Johnson returns, and Grove Street is already dying. The families are fractured. Leadership is weak. Drug dealers now outrank community figures. Children grow up learning survival before morality. Loyalty still exists, but it has nowhere left to go. CJ does not come home to start a war. He comes home to pick through the aftermath. The poison arrived long before him. And what we witness in San Andreas is not the rise of evil, but the consequences of a city that allowed it to spread unchecked. If Phase 1 is about absence, Phase 2 is about presence. Because when the state finally does appear in Los Santos, it doesn't arrive to fix what was broken, it arrives to control what remains. In San Andreas, law enforcement is not portrayed as a stabilizing force, it is portrayed as a predatory one. The police do not exist to serve neighborhoods like Grove Street. They exist to surveil them, intimidate them, and when useful, exploit them. This corruption is embodied in one man, Officer Frank Tenpenny. The crash unit functions less like a police division and more like a criminal syndicate with badges. They control drugs, extort gang members, and manufacture crimes when convenient. Environmentally, the game reinforces this. Police stations feel hostile and unwelcoming. Officers patrol aggressively in black neighborhoods. Helicopters hover, not to protect, but to monitor. Tenpenny doesn't fight crime, he manages it. And to manage it effectively, he needs assets inside the neighborhood he controls. This is where the second fracture forms. Melvin Big Smoke Harris presents himself as comfort, familiarity, stability. He is the one who speaks of unity, of brotherhood, of keeping Grove Street together. His dialogue is filled with nostalgia and loyalty, but Big Smoke is also the most adaptive man in the room. While Sweet Johnson clings to principles, refusing to allow crack into Grove Street, Big Smoke understands the new economy. He recognizes that ideology doesn't pay and morality doesn't protect. So he chooses survival. And in San Andreas, survival often means betrayal. The game never spells out the details immediately. Instead, it lets the truth bleed through the cracks. Big Smoke begins distancing himself from Grove Street's core values. He associates with outsiders. He tolerates drugs, where Sweet forbids them. He speaks of business, where others speak of loyalty. What becomes clear is this: Big Smoke makes a deal with power. Tenpenny doesn't need Grove Street to win. He needs it neutralized. Sweet's refusal to participate in the crack trade makes Grove Street an obstacle, a neighborhood that cannot be controlled through addiction or profit, which is far more dangerous than the one that can. So the solution isn't arrest, it's removal. The plan is surgical. Sweet Johnson must be eliminated not publicly, not cleanly, but in a way that fractures the community permanently. A drive-by shooting, a message, something that looks like gang violence, not state intervention. But plans rarely unfold perfectly. Sweet survives, their mother does not. Her death is not collateral, it is a consequence. The game never frames her as a combatant, because she isn't. She represents the last non-criminal authority in Grove Street still had a moral center, untouched by the street economy. Her death completes that fracture. With her gone, Sweet is consumed by anger. Grove Street loses its anchor. Big Smoke's path forward becomes unobstructed. After the funeral, the game lingers. The streets feel quieter, heavier. Conversations change. The neighborhood no longer feels united. It feels uncertain. This environmental storytelling at its most effective. Nothing explodes. No cutscene explains the betrayal. But the damage is done. And far away, in Liberty City, Carl Johnson receives a call. His mother is dead. Los Santos is calling him home, not to save the city, but to witness what it has already become. Tenpenny's introduction is immediate and deliberate. Within minutes of CJ's arriving in Los Santos, he is abducted, beaten, and framed. No warrant, no explanation, no due process. Tenpenny doesn't need justification. He is the justification. His dialogue makes the power dynamic clear. You do what we say, and you live. This is not law enforcement. This is an occupation. Carl Johnson does not return to Los Santos as a conqueror. He returns from exile. 5 years in Liberty City has distanced him from the rhythms of Grove Street. He speaks differently, thinks differently. The city he left behind has continued to decay without him. And in his absence, the rules have changed. The funeral marks CJ's true re-entry into the city, but it's not a reunion, it is a reckoning. Grove Street is quieter now, smaller, its members are fewer, thinner, and more tense. The sense of community has been replaced by sense of siege. Where there was once pride, there is now paranoia. Sweet makes his expectations clear immediately. CJ didn't come back to mourn. He came back to choose a side. Sweet's dialogue is blunt, unforgiving. You left, I stayed. To Sweet, CJ's absence is not neutral, it is abandonment. And yet, despite his anger, Sweet allows CJ back into the fold. not because he fully trusts him, but because Grove Street cannot afford to lose anyone else. CJ's decision to stay is not driven by ambition or ideology. It is driven by guilt. He wants answers about his mother's death. He wants to repair what he believes he abandoned. And most of all, he wants to belong to something again. So he commits himself fully. He fights Grove Street's battles. He defends its remaining territory. He rebuilds his reputation through action. But what CJ does not yet understand is that Grove Street is no longer a unified front. It is a collection of competing intentions. Big Smoke and Ryder present themselves as allies, brothers in arms, who remained when CJ left, but their behavior is inconsistent. Big Smoke speaks of growth and survival, often framing drug involvement as inevitable rather than immoral. He couches his arguments in practicality. Times change. Ryder, meanwhile, treats violence as entertainment, mocking responsibility and downplaying consequences. His reckless contrasts sharply with Sweet's discipline. CJ notices these differences, but dismisses them because suspicion requires distance. And CJ is too close. Sweet's leadership is rigid, uncompromising, and increasingly out of step with the city around him. He refuses crack not because it is unprofitable, but because it destroys the community from within. Sweet understands something Big Smoke does not or refuses to acknowledge. A neighborhood addicted is a neighborhood controlled. Sweet's resistance isn't ideological, almost old-fashioned. He believes in territory, loyalty, and respect earned through presence, not profit. But the world of San Andreas does not reward principles. It exploits them. Every mission reinforces this tension. Grove Street loses ground while rivals expand. The Ballers thrive through drug money. Allies question Sweet's strategy quietly, never openly. Sweet is fighting a war using rules that no longer apply. CJ begins to notice cracks, not enough to accuse, but enough to unsettle. Operations feel misaligned. Information leaks too easily. Certain members benefit disproportionately from failure. But grief dulls suspicion. CJ is still focused on his mother, on the unanswered questions surrounding her death, on repairing something that may already be beyond saving, and Big Smoke is always there to redirect the conversation, to talk about opportunity, to talk about inevitability, to talk about what has to be done. By recommitting himself to Grove Street, CJ unknowingly embeds himself deeper into a network far larger than he realizes. Police corruption, gang rivalries, drug economies, all intersect at Grove Street. CJ believes he is rebuilding something. In reality, he is being positioned. And as the early missions unfold, one truth becomes increasingly clear. Los Santos does not punish betrayal immediately, it punishes resistance. And when Sweet Johnson is resisting a system that he has already decided his neighborhood's fate, for a time, Carl Johnson believes he is winning. Territory is reclaimed, enemies are pushed back, Grove Street begins to feel alive again, graffiti restored, colors worn openly, pride tentatively returning. But in San Andreas, progress is often just a delay. Because the system CJ is fighting was never designed to be defeated from the outside, only from within. As CJ rises, so does a sense of agency. He becomes indispensable to Sweet, to Grove Street, to forces he doesn't fully understand. But power in Los Santos is deceptive. Every victory CJ achieves exists within boundaries defined by others. The police allow certain conflicts to continue, drug routes remain untouched. Corruption adapts. CJ isn't dismantling the system, he is being used to stabilize it, and beneath the surface, paranoia grows. Caesar's revelation, the truth breaks through. The illusion collapses not through violence, but through witnessing. Caesar Vile Pando, an outsider with no loyalty to Grove Street's internal politics, sees what CJ cannot. From a distance, literally and figuratively, he shows CJ the truth. A green sedan, Big Smoke, Ryder, Officer Tenpenny. Together, the same car was used in the assassination attempt on Sweet. The same car tied to CJ's mother's death. This moment is critical, not because it is shocking, but because it confirms something the game has been whispering all along. The enemy was never just external. CJ's disbelief is immediate and visceral, not denial, but grief. Because betrayal on this scale doesn't just destroy trust, it rewrites memory. Every conversation with Big Smoke is now suspect. Every strategic failure feels intentional. Every death gains a second meaning. Sweet, meanwhile, pays the price for resisting a system that has already judged him obsolete. He is arrested, removed, neutralized, not because he was weak, but because he refused to adapt in the way power demanded. From jail, Sweet's voice changes. The anger gives way to exhaustion. His belief in the system was never strong to begin with and finally collapsed. He understands, too late, that morality without leverage is just another vulnerability. Sweet fought for Grove Street's soul and lost everything else. The eventual downfall of Big Smoke and Tenpenny are not triumphant. They are procedural. Big Smoke dies surrounded by wealth, armed guards, and infrastructure, but utterly alone. His empire is vast, but hollow. Everything he built exists for profit, not belonging. Tenpenny, stripped of authority, dies not as a feared tyrant, but as a man exposed. His power evaporates the moment public scrutiny replaces secrecy. The ends are violent, yes, but also anticlimactic. Because removing individuals does not dismantle systems, and this is the final cruelty of San Andreas. Grove Street does not rise again. By the end, CJ has escaped the gravitational pull of Los Santos. He has resources, mobility, and options his brother never had. Sweet returns, changed, older, disillusioned. The neighborhood remains, but the community does not. No ceremony marks its end, no final battle, no redemption arcs, just silence. Grove Street becomes another name on a map, another place people pass through rather than belong to. CJ leaves the hood not because he abandons it, but because staying would mean accepting that nothing can be rebuilt the way it once was. San Andreas does not end with justice. It ends with survival. The villains fall, the corruption is exposed, but the damage remains etched into the city's layout, its institutions, its memories. Los Santos continues, and that is the most unsettling conclusion of all, because the true evil of San Andreas was never one man, one gang, or one corrupt officer. It was a system that allowed all of this to exist and ensured that even in victory, something irreplaceable would be lost. By the end of San Andreas, the violence stops, but the city does not heal. Los Santos continues to exist not because it was saved, but because it was never meant to change. The names change, the faces disappear, the uniforms rotate, but the structure remains untouched. Carl Johnson survives because he learns when to leave. Sweet survives because he learns when to stop fighting. and Grove Street fades because survival in this world is not the same as victory. San Andreas doesn't ask us to judge its characters. It asks us to observe the environment that shaped them and to recognize how easily systems of neglect, corruption, and profit disguise themselves as inevitability, because the most dangerous form of evil is not chaos, it is normalization. When injustice becomes routine, when exploitation becomes policy, when entire communities are written off as collateral damage. Los Santos didn't collapse, it adapted. And in doing so, it ensured that even those who escape would carry its weight with them.